Am I on? Yes. Good morning, everyone. It's time to get started because this guy's got to go back to the next service and preach. So we're overworking Regan today. This is Regan Sellafield. He is our speaker. If you were here last night, you heard a wonderful talk about how the earth is coming to an end, and it's okay. Is that right? Close enough. Regan holds a Master of Divinity from the Virginia Theological Seminary. He's an ordained Episcopal priest, and he serves as associate priest at Christ Church in Little Rock. He lives in Little Rock, and he's going to talk today. What are you going to talk about today? Watershed Discipleship. And I'm going to run away because I sing in the choir, and I don't know what we're singing this morning. I ought to go practice it. So, Regan Sutterfield.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? So, it's wonderful to be here at St. Paul's. This is actually my first time ever in the doors of St. Paul's, but I've known many wonderful people from this parish. Most recently, Joshua Daniel, who's, I know, one of your seminarians, and many people have said they know Joshua, and we're looking forward to having him back in Arkansas. So I'm going to talk this morning about a concept called watershed discipleship. And I'll get into the details of what exactly this is a little bit later. But first, I want to start with a little bit of background and some rationale for why something like this might be needed. So, the first principle that we need to look at is the idea that our loves form us. And what we deeply care about, what we deeply love, forms us in ways that even more than what we think about or what we do might. But our loves really guide all of those things. Our affections guide our actions. And so it's important that we cultivate our loves towards those things that are deeply meaningful and important. My own interest and care for the creation, for the natural world or the given world, there's many ways to put it, came from my deep love for a particular place in a particular woodland when I was a child. And this is a picture, these children, this is a nature school in Little Rock. I don't know if you have anything like that here, but there's a school for preschool through kindergarten where children are immersed deeply in the natural world. And my daughter's up there in the middle with the hood on, and she's a part of this school. And they spend every day, all day, out in the woods. Whether it's raining or snowing, they just dress differently and appropriately for whatever the weather comes, but they're always outside. And that was what my childhood was like. And so I came to deeply love that little patch of woods that was just in a suburban neighborhood. And with time, I came to defend that place. My first action as an environmentalist was calling the EPA on my neighbors who had dumped some oil down a storm drain that had ended up in a small creek in that woodland and was causing some disruption to the amphibians and some of the birds there. And I was outraged because I so deeply loved that place. So we need to cultivate love for particular places. But what happens so often when we think about our ecological responsibilities or think about the environment as a whole is we can quickly turn towards abstractions. And this is one of those famous graphs from Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth, and these are important in a certain way, but when all of our environmental language and talk and concerns come just around abstract numbers like CO2 counts and levels and parts per million, then we lose sight of the particular concrete realities of what's happening in the world. And it also is, no one will be moved from love to defend a place because of a bar graph or a graph like this. And what happens is when we start to just become focused on these abstract numbers, then we become solely focused in our environmental work and our care for creation on reducing the CO2, and it leads us into destroying natural places in order to lower our carbon count. So here's a picture of windmills off a coastline, and this is a picture of a lithium mine. These are incredibly destructive to particular landscapes and places, and I think that as we expand our so-called clean energy economy, what's going to happen is that we're going to run into new, novel environmental problems, when the more deep response that we should have is to address our way of life that demands so much energy. And that's not to say that windmills and solar panels and lithium batteries don't have their place, but when all of our focus centers on those things, then I think we can lose sight of a more important concern. This is a quote from Wendell Berry, and he's someone who's deeply formed my understandings, and I wrote a book about him, so I'm prone to quote from him. But this, I think, summarizes in a profound way kind of the problem that we faced. Berry says that our understandable wish to preserve the planet must somehow be reduced to the scale of our competence. That is, to the wish to preserve all of Earth's humble households and neighborhoods. The religion and environmentalism of the highly industrialized countries are at bottom a sham, because they make it their business to fight against something they do not really wish to destroy. We all live by robbing nature, but our standard of living demands that the robbery shall continue. We must achieve the character and acquire the skills to live much poorer than we do. We must waste less. We must do more for ourselves and each other. So how do we do this? How do we create communities and develop the practices that will allow us to live on fewer resources, to do more for ourselves and each other, and to rob less from nature, and perhaps even to live and run our economies in such a way that they encourage the flourishing of the natural world rather than its destruction, that they cultivate rather than extract. I think that one of the first steps that we can take, and this is a thing that we can begin to do in our church communities, is to recenter our identity. And this is a quote from Ched Myers, who's a New Testament scholar and also has sort of fostered this with Watershed Discipleship movement. And there is a website, watersheddiscipleship.org, where you can find out more information about what's going on with this. But Ched Myers has called for us to consider this question. What would it mean for Christians to recenter our citizen identity in the topography of creation, rather than in the political geography of dominant cultural ideation, and ground our discipleship practices in the watersheds in which we reside? So in other words, what if you no longer identified as St. Paul's in Fayetteville, but you identified yourself in terms of the ecological space in which you live, the relationships that are formed by ecosystems rather than by political boundaries? And so I might start our conversation with a question: do you know where your ecological place is? Do you know what watershed you're in right now? So can someone tell me your watershed? Beaver, okay. Okay. Okay, so you're right on one of those edges. I worked in a church once that was smack dab in the middle of two watersheds. The roof was basically one half went to one and the other to another. So that's good. So you've got resources here already in your community who know where you are, and that's an important step. So for those who do not know what a watershed is, and I did not before beginning into this journey, a watershed, according to John Wesley Powell, who's one of the founders of this concept, a watershed is that area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common watercourse, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become a part of the community. This is an illustration of a watershed, and it shows a basic pattern that we can find in many watersheds, which is that basically they look like trees. There are small streams and tributaries, some dry streams that only fill up when there's a rain, but they flow into larger streams and into rivers, and then eventually into larger rivers such as the Arkansas and Mississippi, and then eventually into a bay where there's an estuary, and that estuary then divides up the water again. It looks like roots. So most watersheds follow this kind of basic structure. And that watershed forms a sort of bioregion. And a lot of this concept of watershed discipleship is rooted in a larger movement of what's called bioregionalism. And those of you in Fayetteville are actually, could be a part of one of the longest running bioregional organizations, the Ozark Bioregional Congress, that has, I think it's every other year they have this big gathering of all the people who live in the Ozarks and who live in the Ozark bioregion. And they have this interesting democratic process and place where you can learn about ways to work towards the flourishing of the Ozark bioregion. So we don't quite have that in Little Rock. But so permaculturalist Brian Dolman writes that watersheds underlie all human endeavors and form the foundation of all future aspirations and survival. The idea is one of a cradle. Your home basin of relations is your lifeboat. Our watershed represents a community. Every living organism within this basin is interconnected and interdependent. So another way to think of it, thinking from the Hebrew scriptures, is that a watershed is kind of an ark. It's what he calls our lifeboat. It's this basin of relationship where all of the living things that we are connected to are connected through our common watercourses. So watershed discipleship wants to take this concept of the watershed and to replace our faith. And they play on these three different ways in which you can think about watersheds and that term watershed. So the first comes from the idea that we are in a watershed moment. We're in a watershed moment because our ecosystems are in crisis, our climate is in chaos. We are in a time in which we must act now and act deeply to work towards preserving what little we can of the flourishing of creation. And so, in this watershed moment, our response should be to recenter our faith within our ecological place, our watersheds as defined by ecology and geology. And then, to be a disciple means to be a student. A disciple is someone who follows a teacher and learns deeply from that teacher. And so to be a watershed disciple is to realize that in this time and in this place, we must deeply commit ourselves to learning our watersheds. So where are we? We've already heard that we're in the Beaver Reservoir watershed. The University of Arkansas has a great watershed mapping system, so you can put in your address and see exactly which watershed you're in. And there are different ways of dividing hydrologic units. So there's 8-digit, which is a larger watershed, and then they kind of zoom 10-digit and 12. So this is all for St. Paul's. So zooming in a little bit more, we're in the West Fork White River watershed. And then the smallest unit, we are in the Town Branch West Fork White River watershed. So this is where St. Paul's is, at least if I put the address in correctly. So what would a program of watershed discipleship look like for St. Paul's? First, we have to know our neighborhood. Wendell Berry offers what I call kind of a catechesis of place. It's a series of questions, and these are some of the questions that I would invite you to ask of yourself, of your community. Where are we? What is the place in which we are preparing to do our work? What happened here in geologic time? What, if we weren't here, would nature be doing here? What will the nature of the place permit us to do here without exhausting either the place itself or the birthright of those who will come later? What even might nature help us to do here? Under what conditions imposed by the genius of the place and the genius of our own arts might our work here be healthful and beautiful? If you were to take those questions and hand them over to your youth group with a little bit of guidance, be amazing to see what they could come up with. So, what happened here in geologic time? That's a good question to explore. What will the nature of the place permit us to do without exhausting the place? That requires the answer to many more questions about what's happening in the ecosystems here and what are the fundamental ecosystems and plant guilds and various relationships that are happening around St. Paul's. If you were to just abandon a little spot of St. Paul's, what would grow there? What of your landscaping, what would grow there? What would spring up? This practice of watershed discipleship also means that we must meet our neighbors. We need to come to understand who's already living here. How can we welcome more diversity, and how can we increase the flourishing of this place? So once you begin to understand who's living here, you can begin to work towards these other questions of increasing diversity. But first, you really have to start with understanding who is already here around St. Paul's. What are the trees that are growing in your landscape? What birds make their home in those trees? What sorts of insects are there? It doesn't require a large landscape to begin to engage with these questions. I moved into a kind of new old house this last summer. It's kind of a long story, but I moved into this house, and the person who had lived there previously had planted this lantana bush. And it's a cultivated flower, but there's also native varieties of it, and it is a great attractant for butterflies. And I don't know very much about butterflies, and so I had a field guide, and my daughter and I started to identify the different butterflies that were coming to our lantana. And one of these butterflies was a Gulf Fritillary, which I had never even paid attention to. It's a fairly large orange butterfly could easily be mistaken for a monarch if you weren't paying attention. And I just never seen one, even though once I recognized them, I saw them everywhere. But the Gulf fritillaries were coming to my lantana bush, and a friend of mine who worked for the Natural Heritage Commission stopped by once, and he said, "Oh, you've got a lot of Gulf fritillaries. There must be passion vine somewhere close by." Because passion vine is the only type of plant that Gulf fritillary caterpillars will eat from. So I said, what does passion vine look like? And I started to look around my yard, and I found that I had actually a lot of passion vine. And I found Gulf fritillary caterpillars, and I found Gulf fritillary cocoons or chrysalises, and I found breeding Gulf fritillaries in my yard. And there's this whole ecosystem that was happening right there in a very small urban yard, but I had not known about it before I had begun to ask this question: who's living here? And there's so much more to discover. Breaking back some leaves, I found a little brown snake that I found is an earth snake, which then I discovered is a snake that actually gives live birth. And there's a whole category of those snakes, which I never knew about. So these questions can lead us into a lifetime of discovery, and that lifetime of discovery could just leave us never getting past our yard. So you have plenty of work to do just with the campus here, like you have at St. Paul's. The other important work of Watershed Discipleship is to learn to recognize the sacred and desecrated places in your neighborhood. Wendell Berry said, "There are no unsacred places, there are only sacred places and desecrated places." And I think that is one of the key insights for my own life. I was struck a couple of years ago when there was the standoff in North Dakota over the Dakota Access Pipeline. And there were Native people who were defending their land and their waters from this oil pipeline coming through. What struck me was how so many people who were not Native or really lived far from the concerns of North Dakota water really came to that cause, even though there are many pipelines being built around the country. And I think what struck a chord with people was here was a people who had a relationship with the land and also had a sense of its sacredness that would be violated by something like an oil pipeline. While so many of us have no sense of the sacredness of the land, and a pipeline coming through would not feel like any kind of desecration. So I think we should begin to cultivate a sense of sacredness of the land so that when those desecrating practices come, we can respond appropriately. One way that I'm doing this or experimenting with this is simply to take the liturgies of the Christian church out into the woods and to have Eucharist in the woods, but also to spend time in meditation in the woods and invite people to come and build temporary labyrinths out of found objects. So we've been doing this last summer, and we're going to continue it again this summer. We go to various spots, and we build these labyrinths together and walk them and recognize the sacredness of these particular places. And the hope is that from that, we can also go on to mark the desecration of particular places. Because this idea of building labyrinths on the landscape actually came to me when I passed by on my way to church. I was bicycling to a church I was serving where they were cutting down a lot of trees for new development. And it was a cold morning, and the snow had just fallen, and in the tracks of a bulldozer, the bulldozer tracks were in this circular pattern that looked like a labyrinth, the way that the snow had settled in those tracks. And I saw that as this mark of the sacredness of the place that had now been desecrated. We must also, in our practice of watershed discipleship, begin the work of healing. And this is one of my favorite examples because it gets, I think, at so many intersecting problems with a really wonderful sort of destructive but creative solution. And this is depaving. This is in Portland. There's an organization called dpave.org, and you contact them, and they will come help you tear out your parking lot. And they get a big crew of volunteers, and they have jackhammers, and what they're doing is parking lots are non-permeable surfaces, and so all the water that falls on them just collects pollution and runs off into the storm drains and into our waterways. The best place for water to go is straight down into the soil where it will be filtered out. And as much water as we can trap and send down into the ground where we are, the better, rather than it just running off into our waterways. So depave, they don't usually tear out the entire parking lot, but for churches or communities that can offer a witness by just tearing out a section, they'll help them tear out the section and build a rain garden there, a garden that's particularly built so that it will catch water and filter it down into the ground. And but there are many other activities that we could do to promote the work of healing. Planting native plants around in our landscaping, that each native plant can have particular relationships with particular insects, and then those particular insects have particular relationships with birds, and so on and so forth. So plants that are well adapted to our climate, well adapted to our local landscapes are important. So, if you were planting buckeye, for instance, red buckeye, which is a wonderful native plant here in the Ozarks, hummingbirds favor those, or pawpaws, which provide a wonderful custardy fruit, but also are the larval plant for the zebra swallowtail butterfly. There's all kinds of things that you can do with native landscaping. So I don't want to talk forever, and I want to leave a little bit of time for conversation before I have to dash back to church and get ready to preach. So, so are there any questions? Yes.
A lot of this stuff could be approached in a logical, secular fashion. Even an atheist could build a rain garden. But could you say something about how engaging in these activities becomes a spiritual path for the people that do it?
Yes, certainly. So how might these practices be a spiritual path for those who participate? Because a lot of what I've mentioned could be approached in a purely secular way. That's the question, right? So I do think that there are a couple of ways to answer that. One is, there is a deep sense, I think, that most people have of connection in the natural world. And many of my friends who either grew up in a particular religious tradition and then rejected it, or simply grew up with no religious tradition and have never had one, many of them will talk about some sense of the sacredness of the sacred that they experience when they are in natural places. And so I think that that's something that these practices can help cultivate, particularly if we add some of those elements of inviting meditation, using sacred practices like labyrinth building and walking. So I think those are particular ways that we could engage with this. But thinking from a particularly Christian perspective, part of it is recovering some of the deepest parts of our tradition. the Christian tradition is rich and deep and full of resources for those of us who care about the natural world. And there have been plenty of ways in which people have taken bits and pieces of Scripture and have abused them or have used them to abuse the land. But I think that if we really dig more deeply into our Scriptures, we will find profound resources there. And Ched Myers is a great example of someone who's doing this. Ched Myers is a Bible scholar. That's his calling. But he went the other direction from going into an academic career, even though his commentary on the Gospel of Mark is kind of the standard for many people. But he's always lived as kind of an academic activist. He worked for many years as a peace activist with the Quakers. But he's always been doing these deep Bible studies. And I was recently at a gathering with him, and he did this amazing study of the Gospel of Mark and this passage around Jesus' baptism. And he pointed out that Jesus was not, that the Greek, where it says that Jesus was baptized in the river, that translation isn't quite right. There's another way to translate it that's really the preferred way, which would be to say that Jesus was baptized into the Jordan River. And he explored what the Jordan River had meant for the people of Israel and the way in which that river had come to exhibit and exemplify the journey of the people out of slavery and into the freedom that came with the Exodus. He also did a brilliant look at that very difficult passage where Jesus talks about how if your limb causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it into the, and he explored the idea of addiction and how we all live with this deep addiction to both our consumer lifestyles and also to oil. And he talked about all of the ecological devastation that's happening because of our fossil fuel, our burning of fossil fuels, but he kept repeating, and still we drive. And even those of us who care about these things still drive. And he said, we need to look at that as an addiction. And what Jesus is, and many addicts will use the language of losing an appendage when they think about cutting off that addiction because it becomes a part of you. And it's something that you have to cut away. And that he thinks is this interpretation of the Gospel of Mark. So this may not be answering your question exactly, but I think that we can, the church, our scriptures, our tradition have a lot of resources that I think can be helpful in inviting people into a sacred sense of the world and a sense that the world belongs to more than our own use and ambitions, that it's not even just about the next generation as we often talk about it, but it's really that the world is something that we are a part of, a larger creation, all of which was already called good, and that we violate that when we live in ways that are destructive to it. I see a question way in the back.
Yeah, I was going to say, we need to rescue the worms, too. This morning it was raining real heavily, and you could see them all stuck on the concrete and the road, and they're just moving around, and they bury the soil. I mean, for the plants, everything that's on top of the ground, and then we're putting pesticides all over everything, and that affects everything under the ground as well as on top of it.
Yes. So that non-permeable surface is a major problem for worms and other creatures that live in the soil. And we're only now beginning to discover really the complex ecosystems that are there in the soil. And I think it's helpful for us thinking about being human beings drawn from the humus that kind of diversity. Yes, sir.
I think we could put it into a biblical context and just
Love thy nature as thyself. Yes. Yes. Well, and one of the profound realities, speaking of soil ecology, microbes, is that we keep discovering our connections to the larger world, and it's not as though even in our own bodies we are isolated from other creatures. Just for us to be healthy, thriving human beings, we have to be connected to a wide array of microbes and fungi. I mean, even your respiration is dependent upon fungi. So, and you wouldn't be able to digest food well if your microbes are. So now there's this whole movement around probiotics. But what does that mean for us in thinking about the incarnation? That's something I think about a lot. The first members of the body of Christ were probably nematodes and bacteria, and so when we talk about ourselves, there's that. I think our understanding from biology is actually making even just that idea of a self more complex, because none of us are just individual creatures on our own. We're just to be a healthy, thriving human being, we're already this relationship. So to talk about myself is to talk about a community.
One of the things that I sort of came to conclusion about when I was learning from this was that we are so disembodied. And so, what does it mean to love a neighbor? Get you also back to what you are. This creature. This creature on this fragile planet. I mean, that's what we think we are. But I just think it can be so profound if we, get to know our neighbors of all types. Then we also get to know ourselves, and that we make community. I don't know. Is that sort of like?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. So I think this reclaiming of our embodiment is really one of the crucial parts of all of this, and I think that talking about our spiritual lives, it's important that we sort of make those spirits incarnational, in not to have a spirit without flesh on it, there's a way in which there's a way in which the Gospels work, and I think particularly Jesus' teaching works, which I think is always to point people back to real bodies and the needs of real bodies, and thinking about what comes to be known in the tradition as the corporal works of mercy, those bodily works of mercy. And there's a way to think about those things, and if we really pay attention to those things, then we'll be connected to a larger ecosystem. So, for instance, the corporal works of mercy, as kind of understood in the Catholic tradition, are many of the things that Jesus talked about in some of his discourses, but visiting those in prison, visiting and giving drink to the thirsty. Well, if you're giving drink to the thirsty, you have to start paying attention to water, because what kind of drink are you giving? So we've seen with Flint just how complicated and troublesome our water questions around water can be. We also, if we are going to clothe the naked as one of the other ones, have to start paying attention to the kinds of clothes that we wear. This is something that I've only recently really started to pay attention to, but so many of our clothes are made up of various materials that create microplastics that have really detrimental effects in the environment, because many of those plastics can act as estrogenic elements in the environment and can have major effects on, for instance, frogs that frogs and amphibians are particularly sensitive to their environments. And so because of these false estrogens that are in our waterways, they are starting to do all sorts of strange things, like grow more limbs than they should, or fewer limbs than they should. Or I was just on a walk with a herpetologist recently who was pointing out some three-legged frogs that are affected by this sort of thing, but even our clothing. So when we start to pay attention to some of those just basic corporal works of, and I think then we start to get connected to all of these other bodies. So I'll leave it at that. Well, that's a good question. I may not be the best to answer it, but I will say that I have a background. Before I was going into the sort of philosophy, theology direction, I worked, when I first went to college, I thought I was going to be a biology major, and I had worked for a couple of summers as a field ornithologist. So I've had this lifelong interest in ecology and the natural world. That then I kind of got into philosophy in high school and went a different direction. But I think, first of all, I'll mention a couple of resources. Our former presiding bishop, Catherine Jefferts Shorey, was an oceanographer before she became a priest. And she has some really wonderful talks you can find on YouTube and things about this intersection of science and religion. And I had the fortune of, when she finished her term as presiding bishop, she taught a course at my seminary on this intersection of science and religion. But I'll say that I think that the bridging factor should be science as a mode of inquiry is different from what comes to be termed as sort of naturalistic materialism, which is this idea that there's nothing more than what the observable universe, and that. So I think that oftentimes people claim that as science, but it's no more science than anything else. It's really a philosophical position that values science highly, but is not science itself. So it's important to make that kind of distinction. But in thinking about a lot of these kinds of questions, I've come to think that describe my position as one of realism. I'm interested in reality. I'm interested in calling people to live into reality. And but I think that reality is far more strange and mysterious and complex than we often imagine, and that there's a lot more to it than just what is currently observable to us in our universe. And so I think that there's no particular conflict between science and religion, and I think some of those conflicts come oftentimes, from one or the other side, misunderstanding either itself or the other. So, for instance, I grew up in a Christian tradition that, it was kind of like a make or break issue. of whether you believed in six-day creationism. And if you didn't believe in that, then you probably weren't really a Christian, and you certainly didn't take the Bible seriously. Well, I've come to a very different position, and I came to it first because of a real interest in paleontology, and I started to look at the fossil record and to see all of these counterexamples to that. But then, as I've developed in my understanding of scriptures, I've come to see that reading of the Genesis account, for instance, as a terrible misreading of what's going on there. The people who wrote Genesis 1 and 2 were not concerned about, scientific truths. That wasn't their purpose. Their purpose was to create a counter myth to the surrounding cultures around them who said that the world was what was a chaotic thing that had come about through an accident or through the violent acts of the gods. One of the early myths that would have been circulating at that time was that the heavens and the earth were basically the two sides of the body of a goddess that had been murdered and cut in half, and that human beings were created to be slaves. The biblical narratives are created to be a counter to that, but they were countering those narratives. They weren't trying to create a scientific account. They were trying to create this poetic account that would say the world is good, the world is ordered, and human beings are created in the image of God rather than simply to be the slaves of the gods, as these other myths. So I think really going deep in our understanding of science and deep in our understanding of religion can be a counter, because most mistakes happen because people just don't go deep enough. So I think I better leave it there if I'm going to make it back in time to get to the next service. So thank you.